Some doors should remain locked forever. Thomas Wright discovered this truth on a winter night, when curiosity led him into the abandoned west wing of Mercy General Hospital, where he found something that had been waiting in the darkness for 40 years. Thomas had been the night janitor at Mercy General for 8 months. It was lonely work, the kind that attracted people who preferred silence over conversation, shadows over spotlight. At 62 years old, divorced and estranged from his only daughter, Thomas found comfort in the predictable rhythm of mopping floors and emptying trash bins while the rest of the world slept. The hospital at night was his domain, a kingdom of echoes and fluorescent lights where he could exist without judgment or expectation. But there was one place even Thomas avoided. The West Wing had been sealed off since 1985, closed after what hospital administrators vaguely referred to as structural concerns. The entrance was blocked by chains and warning signs, the windows boarded from the inside. In 8 months, Thomas had never seen anyone go near it. The other night, staff spoke about it in whispers when they spoke about it at all. Some claimed they heard sounds coming from behind those sealed doors, footsteps in empty corridors, voices calling for help that never came. Thomas dismissed these stories as the usual hospital folklore, the ghost tales that medical staff tell to make their shifts more interesting. He was a practical man, grounded in the reality of mop water and disinfectant, not inclined toward supernatural nonsense. But on the night of January 15th, everything changed. It started with the footsteps. Thomas was cleaning the 4th floor hallway, the same routine he performed every night when he heard them. Slow, deliberate steps echoing from somewhere beyond the sealed entrance to the West Wing. He stopped mopping, listening carefully. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking in that abandoned section, their shoes clicking against tile floors that shouldn't have felt human weight in decades. His first thought was intruders, maybe teenagers looking for a thrill or homeless people seeking shelter from the cold. He approached the chained entrance, pressing his ear against the door. The footsteps continued, growing louder, as if whoever was inside was approaching from the other side. Thomas called out, identifying himself as hospital staff, demanding whoever was inside to come out immediately. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed against him like a physical weight. Then from behind the door a voice, weak, trembling, desperate. The voice belonged to a child, a little girl asking for help, saying she was lost and scared and couldn't find her way out. She begged Thomas to open the door, to come get her, to take her back to her mother. The plea in her voice cut through his practical nature, triggering every protective instinct a parent develops even when their own children have grown distant. Thomas knew he should call security, should follow protocol and report the situation to proper authorities, but the desperation in that small voice overrode his training. A child was trapped in there, alone and frightened. Every second he delayed was another second of terror for her. He found the master key hanging in the maintenance office, the one that supposedly opened every door in the hospital, including the ones that were meant to stay closed. The chains fell away with a rattle that echoed through the empty hallway. Thomas pushed the door open, and cold air rushed out like breath escaping from a tomb. The smell hit him immediately, not decay or rot as he expected, but something else. Antiseptic and old paper, the scent of a place frozen in time. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, almost solid. The West Wing looked exactly as it must have looked in 1985. Gurneys lined the hallways covered in dust. Wheelchairs sat abandoned mid-corridor, as if their occupants had simply vanished. Charts still hung on walls, patient names visible under layers of grime. It was a snapshot of the past, perfectly preserved, waiting for staff that would never return and patients whose fates remained unrecorded. Thomas called out for the girl, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response came. He moved deeper into the wing, his flashlight revealing room after room of frozen medical history. In one room, toys sat on a bed, a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing staring at him with button eyes. In another, flowers long dead remained in a vase, their petals turned to dust. Each room told a story of interruption, of moments that stopped without warning or explanation. The footsteps started again, behind him now. Thomas spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across empty hallway. Nothing. But he heard them clearly, the same measured pace, the same deliberate rhythm. They were leading him deeper into the wing, away from the exit, toward the far end where the pediatric ward had been located. He should have turned back. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to seal the door again and forget what he heard. But that voice, that desperate child's voice, it haunted him. He thought of his own daughter, how he had failed to protect her from life's cruelties, how distance had grown between them until they were strangers, sharing only DNA. Maybe he couldn't save that relationship, but he could save this child. He could do this one thing right. The pediatric ward stretched before him, a long corridor lined with small rooms designed for young patients. The footsteps led him to the last room on the left, room 412. The door stood slightly ajar, darkness beyond more complete than anywhere else in the wing. Thomas pushed it open fully, his flashlight revealing a space that made his breath catch in his throat. The room was set up for a child, but everything was wrong. Medical equipment surrounded a small bed, machines that Thomas didn't recognize, their purposes unclear. Charts covered the walls, not medical charts, but drawings. Hundreds of drawings made by a child's hand, depicting the same scene over and over. A little girl standing alone in a dark room, reaching toward a door that remained forever closed. On the bed sat a stuffed bear, newer than everything else in the room, placed deliberately in the center. Around its neck hung a note written in careful handwriting. Thomas picked it up, his hands shaking as he read words that changed everything he thought he understood about this place. The note explained what happened in 1985, why the wing was really sealed. It told a story of medical experiments, of treatments that crossed ethical lines, of a child who had been forgotten when everything went wrong. And it ended with a question that made Thomas's blood run cold. A question that suggested he wasn't here by accident, that the footsteps had been calling him specifically, that whatever remained in this abandoned wing had chosen him for a reason he was only beginning to understand. Behind him, the door to room 412 swung shut with a final click. Thomas stood frozen in room 412, the note trembling in his hands. The door had closed behind him, and when he tried the handle, it refused to turn. Locked. Impossible, since these old doors didn't have internal locks. Yet here he was, sealed inside with only his flashlight, and the growing realization that he had walked into something far beyond a simple trespassing situation. The note was dated March 7th, 1985, 40 years ago to the month. It was written by a nurse named Catherine Wells, addressed to whoever might find it, a confession left behind in a room that was meant to be forgotten forever. Thomas read it 3 times, each reading making the situation more horrifying and more impossible to dismiss as imagination. Catherine Wells had worked in the pediatric ward of the West Wing. She wrote about a patient, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Brennan, who had been admitted with an aggressive neurological condition that doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. The girl's parents were wealthy, influential, desperate for any solution that might save their only child. They brought in specialists from across the country, researchers who operated in gray areas between medicine and experimentation. The treatment started in February of 1985. Catherine described procedures that made Thomas's stomach turn, experimental drugs that hadn't been approved for human use, therapies that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics into territory that felt criminal. Sarah suffered through it all, her small body becoming a laboratory for ambitious doctors who convinced her parents that conventional medicine had failed and only radical approaches could save her. But Sarah didn't get better. She got worse. The treatments damaged her brain in ways the doctors hadn't anticipated, leaving her trapped in a state between consciousness and coma. She could hear and understand everything happening around her, but she couldn't move or speak or signal her awareness. The doctors realized their mistake too late. Rather than admit what they had done, they made a decision that Catherine couldn't live with. They declared Sarah brain dead. They told her parents she had passed away peacefully, They held a funeral with an empty casket, claiming her body had been donated to medical research per a consent form the parents didn't remember signing. But Sarah wasn't dead. She was still in room 412, still trapped in her frozen body, still aware and terrified and abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect her. Catherine had discovered the truth by accident, working a late shift when she heard crying coming from room 412. She found Sarah alone, tears running down her face, the only part of her body she could still control. Catherine tried to tell the hospital administration, tried to expose what the doctors had done, but she was silenced. Threatened with legal action, with losing her license, with worse consequences if she didn't keep quiet about the experimental program. The note ended with Catherine's shame and guilt. She had kept silent, had allowed the cover-up to continue, had walked away from that room and that child because she was too afraid to fight back. The West Wing was sealed shortly after, officially due to structural problems, but really to bury evidence of what had happened there. And Sarah, according to Catherine's final words, was left inside, alone in the darkness, forgotten by everyone except the nurse whose conscience wouldn't let her forget. Thomas lowered the note, his mind struggling to process what he had read. If this was true, if any of it was real, then Sarah Brennan had been sealed inside this wing for 40 years. But that was impossible. No one could survive that long without food or water or medical care. Unless she had died here, trapped and aware until the very end, dying slowly in darkness while the rest of the hospital continued around her. He looked around room 412 again, seeing it with new understanding. The medical equipment was wrong because it was experimental, custom-built for procedures that should never have been performed. The drawings on the walls were Sarah's, created during the brief period when she still had control of her hands, depicting her fear and isolation. The stuffed bear on the bed was placed there recently, suggesting someone still visited this room, still remembered what happened here. The temperature in the room had dropped further. Thomas could see his breath now, clouds of vapor in the flashlight beam. The walls seemed to press inward, the space shrinking or maybe his panic expanding. He needed to get out, needed to call someone, needed to report what he had found. But the door remained locked, and his cell phone had no signal this deep inside the abandoned wing. Then he heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they were inside the room with him, circling slowly, deliberately. Thomas spun around, his flashlight sweeping across empty space, finding nothing. The steps continued, patient and measured, as if whatever made them was in no hurry, knew Thomas had nowhere to go. A sound emerged from the darkness. Soft at first, then growing louder. Crying. A child crying with the kind of desperation that comes from abandonment and betrayal. Thomas had heard his own daughter cry like that once, when he told her he was leaving, that the marriage was over, that everything she knew was about to change. He had walked away from her tears then, unable to handle her pain. The memory filled him with shame that had never fully faded. The crying moved around the room, coming from different directions, as if the source was everywhere and nowhere. Thomas called out to Sarah, using her name from the note, telling her he knew what happened, that he wanted to help. The crying stopped abruptly. Silence fell like a weight. Then, on the wall opposite him, something began to appear. Words formed in the dust and grime covering the wall, written by invisible fingers. They spelled out a question that made Thomas's blood run cold. The question asked if he was brave enough to see the truth, if he could handle knowing what really happened in this room, what the doctors did to a helpless child in the name of progress and ambition. Thomas wanted to say no, wanted to close his eyes and refuse to witness whatever horror was about to be revealed. But he thought of Catherine's note, of her cowardice and lifelong guilt. He thought of his daughter, and all the times he had turned away from difficult truths, because facing them required courage he didn't possess. Maybe he couldn't fix his own failures, but he could choose differently now. He spoke into the darkness, his voice steady despite his fear. He told Sarah he wanted to know the truth, that she deserved to have her story heard, that what was done to her was wrong, and should never have been hidden. The words on the wall faded. The room fell silent. Then the flashlight in Thomas's hand went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. In the absolute darkness, Thomas felt something change in the air around him. The temperature dropped so severely that ice crystals formed on his breath, each exhale visible even without light as faint clouds of frozen vapor. The silence was complete, oppressive, as if the room existed outside normal space and time. Then the visions began. They didn't appear before his eyes. They appeared inside his mind, forced directly into his consciousness with such intensity that Thomas couldn't distinguish them from memory. He saw room 412 as it had been in 1985, filled with equipment that hummed and beeped with mechanical indifference. A small girl lay in the bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her eyes open and aware, but her body completely still. Sarah Brennan, 7 years old, trapped in the prison of her own flesh. Thomas witnessed the procedures through Sarah's perspective, felt what she felt, the terror of hearing doctors discuss her condition as if she couldn't understand, the agony of treatments that burned through her nervous system while she screamed internally, with no voice to release the sound. The devastating moment when her parents said goodbye, believing she was brain dead, never knowing she could hear every word of their grief and was silently begging them not to leave. He experienced her abandonment, days passing in darkness after the West Wing was sealed, hunger that eventually faded into numbness, thirst that made her throat roar before that too became distant sensation, the slow shutdown of her body while her mind remained horrifyingly alert, counting seconds that stretched into eternities. She had died in this room, but it took weeks, weeks of absolute isolation, of consciousness without hope, of a child understanding that no rescue was coming. But death hadn't ended her awareness. Thomas felt the moment her heart stopped expecting release, finding instead a different kind of imprisonment. Sarah's consciousness had remained, bound to room 412 by the intensity of her suffering and the injustice of her fate. For 40 years she had existed here, a presence without form, witnessing the hospital continue around her while she remained forgotten in this sealed tomb. The visions released Thomas suddenly, and he fell to his knees, gasping. His flashlight flickered back to life, revealing the room once more. But now he could see her. Sarah stood beside the bed, translucent and fading at the edges like morning mist. She looked exactly as she had in the visions, 7 years old, wearing a hospital gown, her expression carrying suffering no child should ever know. She spoke, and her voice was the one that had called him into the West Wing. She told him why she had brought him here, why she had chosen him specifically out of all the staff who worked at Mercy General. Thomas had a daughter he had abandoned emotionally, if not physically, a daughter who still waited for him to come back into her life with the love and attention she deserved. Sarah had sensed this connection, this pattern of abandonment that echoed her own experience. She gave Thomas a choice. The same choice she had given to 3 others over the past 40 years, people who had entered the West Wing and found their way to room 412. He could leave this room, seal the door behind him, return to his life, and forget everything he had witnessed. The hospital administration would never believe his story. The note from Catherine Wells would disappear. He would be alone with this knowledge, carrying the weight of Sarah's suffering without ability to share it or find relief. Or he could stay. He could remain in room 412 and keep Sarah company in her eternal imprisonment. His body would eventually be found, explained away as a heart attack or stroke, but his consciousness would remain here with her. She was so lonely. 40 years of solitude had eroded her sense of self until she barely remembered what it felt like to have human connection. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She just didn't want to be alone anymore. Thomas looked at this ghost of a child and felt his heart breaking. The choice she offered was impossible, a decision between abandoning her to continued isolation or sacrificing himself to ease suffering he had no responsibility for. Yet even as he thought this, He recognized the parallel to his own life. His daughter wasn't trapped in a hospital room, but she was isolated by his emotional absence. He had chosen his own comfort over her need for a father, had abandoned her in ways less dramatic, but no less damaging than what the doctors had done to Sarah. He asked Sarah what happened to the others, the 3 people she had offered this choice before. Her answer chilled him to his core. They had all chosen to leave. They had promised to tell her story, to expose what happened, to bring justice for her suffering. But once they left room 412, once they crossed back into the normal world, their conviction faded. The experience seemed like hallucination. The evidence disappeared. They convinced themselves it had been imagination or exhaustion, and they moved on with their lives while Sarah remained behind, betrayed again by adults who couldn't follow through on their promises. Thomas understood now. This wasn't just about choosing to stay or go. It was about whether he was the kind of person who kept his word even when it cost him everything. About whether he could be brave enough to do the right thing when doing the wrong thing was so much easier and more reasonable. About whether love and compassion were just words he claimed to value or principles he would sacrifice for. He thought about his daughter, about the years he had wasted maintaining distance because confronting his failures as a father felt too painful. He thought about Catherine Wells, who had lived with crushing guilt because she chose self-preservation over a child's welfare. He thought about the 3 others who had stood where he stood now and walked away, probably spending the rest of their lives wondering if they had made the right choice. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. Sarah's ghostly form flickered like a candle in wind, fading and strengthening, as if her very existence depended on his response. Outside room 412, the hospital continued its endless rhythm of life and death, healing and suffering, completely unaware of the impossible choice being made in this forgotten corner. Thomas stood up slowly, his joints aching from kneeling on cold floor. He looked directly at Sarah, this child who had suffered more than any being should suffer, and he made his decision. But before he could speak the words that would seal his fate, the door to room 412 burst open. Light flooded in from the hallway, harsh and bright after so much darkness. Security guards stood in the doorway, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Behind them, hospital administrators and maintenance staff crowded together, their faces showing concern and confusion. They had been searching for Thomas for hours after someone noticed the West Wing entrance had been unsealed. They called his name, asking if he was hurt, extending hands to help him leave this dangerous abandoned section. Thomas turned back to look at Sarah, but she was gone. The room appeared exactly as it had when he first entered. Empty bed, dusty equipment, drawings on the walls too faded to read clearly. The stuffed bear was still there, but the note around its neck had vanished. No evidence remained of anything supernatural, nothing to prove the visions had been real rather than hallucination. The security guards pulled Thomas gently toward the door, explaining that the West Wing was unstable, that he could have been seriously hurt, that they needed to get him checked out by medical staff immediately. As they led him into the hallway, Thomas looked back one final time. In the shadows at the far corner of room 412, barely visible in the mixing light and darkness, he saw her, Sarah, watching him leave like all the others had left her. The expression on her small face wasn't anger or betrayal, it was resignation. She had known he would abandon her too. Everyone always did. They took Thomas to the emergency department for evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong physically, just elevated stress hormones and signs of mild hypothermia from exposure to the cold air in the abandoned wing. They asked him questions about what he experienced, their voices carefully neutral, professional. Thomas tried to explain about Sarah, about the note, about the visions and the choice he had been given. The doctors exchanged glances that Thomas recognized. They thought he was having a breakdown. Hospital administration arrived within the hour. They were less concerned about Thomas's well-being and more interested in liability. They asked repeatedly if he had been injured, if he blamed the hospital for anything, if he needed anything that might prevent legal action. They explained that the West Wing had been scheduled for demolition for years, that entering it had been incredibly dangerous, that he was fortunate the floor hadn't collapsed beneath him. Thomas insisted they investigate room 412, that they would find evidence of what happened to Sarah Brennan in 1985. The administrators became uncomfortable, exchanging looks that suggested they knew exactly what he was talking about. The senior administrator, a woman named Mrs. Holloway, who had worked at Mercy General for 30 years, finally told him the truth he hadn't wanted to consider. There was no Sarah Brennan. There had never been any patient by that name in the hospital's records. The West Wing had been sealed in 1985, but not because of medical experiments or cover-ups. It had been closed due to asbestos contamination and budget constraints, nothing more sinister than financial reality and outdated building materials. Room 412 had been a storage room, not a patient room. No child had ever been treated there. No nurse named Catherine Wells had ever worked in that wing. Thomas argued, demanded they check again, insisted he had seen documentation. But Mrs. Holloway was patient and firm. She had heard this story before, not the exact details, but the pattern. Every few years, someone entered the West Wing, despite the warnings. Usually security guards or maintenance workers, people who worked night shifts alone. And they always came out claiming they had encountered a ghost, usually a child, always in room 412. She explained what Thomas couldn't accept. The West Wing had a toxic mold problem in addition to the asbestos, a specific species that produced compounds affecting brain function. Exposure caused vivid hallucinations, especially in people who were stressed, isolated, or dealing with unresolved guilt. The hallucinations typically involved children, because the exposed person's subconscious projected their own emotional issues into narrative form. The mold essentially turned people's guilt and regrets into waking nightmares. Thomas wanted to reject this explanation, but Mrs. Holloway showed him records. 3 other people in the past 15 years had entered the West Wing and reported nearly identical experiences. A security guard who had lost custody of his children. A nurse dealing with grief over a patient who died under her care. A maintenance worker estranged from his family. All of them encountered a ghost in room 412. All of them experienced visions related to their personal failures. All of them came out convinced they had witnessed something supernatural. Blood tests confirmed Thomas had been exposed to the mold. The compounds were in his system, already being processed out, but present in concentrations that would absolutely cause hallucinations. The doctors explained this gently, assuring him that what he experienced felt real because his brain had been chemically altered to perceive hallucination as reality. There was no shame in it. The mold was dangerous, which was exactly why the West Wing remained sealed. Thomas sat in the hospital bed, surrounded by rational explanations and scientific evidence, and felt his certainty crumbling. Had it all been hallucination? Had his guilt over abandoning his daughter created an elaborate fantasy about the abandoned child who needed him? The timeline made sense. The symptoms matched. The pattern of others experiencing similar encounters was damning evidence against the supernatural interpretation. They kept him overnight for observation. In the morning, Mrs. Holloway returned with paperwork. Thomas would be placed on paid leave while he recovered from the mold exposure. The hospital would cover all medical costs and provide counseling services. In exchange, he would sign a document acknowledging that his experience was caused by toxic exposure, not negligence by the hospital, and that he would not discuss the incident publicly in ways that might damage Mercy General's reputation. Thomas signed. What else could he do? The evidence against Sarah's existence was overwhelming. He returned home to his small apartment, took the pills the doctors prescribed, attended the counseling sessions the hospital required. The therapist was kind and competent, helping him explore his feelings about his daughter, his divorce, his loneliness. She never dismissed his experience in the West Wing, but gently guided him toward accepting it as a manifestation of his psychological state rather than supernatural encounter. Weeks passed. Thomas returned to work, though he was reassigned to the East Wing, far from the sealed section. He avoided talking about that night, and his co-workers avoided asking. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The vivid memories of Sarah faded at the edges, becoming dreamlike and uncertain. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe it had been the mold and his own guilt creating elaborate fiction. Then, 3 months after the incident, Thomas received a letter. It arrived at his apartment with no return address, postmarked from a city 200 miles away. Inside was a single page, yellowed with age, written in careful handwriting. He recognized it immediately. It was Catherine Wells's note, the one that had been tied around the stuffed bear's neck, the one that had supposedly disappeared. But this version was different. It included additional paragraphs that Thomas didn't remember reading. Catherine explained that she knew about the mold, knew the hospital administration would use it to discredit anyone who discovered the truth about Sarah. She warned that they had been using this explanation for decades, dismissing witnesses and burying evidence behind medical science that sounded credible, but was actually carefully constructed cover-up. The note included names, other nurses who had known about Sarah, doctors who had participated in the experiments, administrators who had orchestrated the cover-up, and it included proof. Catherine had hidden documents in a specific location, physical evidence that couldn't be explained away as hallucination. She provided exact instructions for finding this evidence, buried in the hospital's oldest archives, filed under categories that would never be searched. Thomas's hands shook as he read. If this note was real, if he hadn't imagined it, then everything the hospital told him was a lie. Sarah had existed, the experiments had happened, and the mold explanation was just another layer of the cover-up, a convenient way to discredit witnesses while seeming to care about their well-being. But if the note wasn't real, if this was part of his continuing delusion, then following its instructions would only prove he needed more help than the hospital had provided. He stared at the yellowed paper, trying to decide what was real and what was construction of his damaged mind. The next morning, Thomas made his choice. He would find the archives Catherine described, he would search for the evidence she claimed existed, and he would know finally whether Sarah Brennan had been a real child who suffered and died, or a ghost created by toxic mold and his own failures as a father. What he found would reveal a truth more horrifying than either possibility. Thomas found the archives exactly where Catherine's note described. In the sub-basement of Mercy General, behind maintenance equipment that hadn't been moved in decades, a door led to record storage that predated digital systems. The room smelled of decay and forgotten history, metal filing cabinets lined against walls that wept with moisture. He searched for 6 hours, following Catherine's precise instructions. Third cabinet from the east wall, bottom drawer, files misfiled under psychiatric care instead of pediatrics. And there, exactly as she promised, he found Sarah Brennan's real medical records. Not hallucination, not mold-induced fantasy. Physical documents he could touch, photograph, prove existed beyond his own perception. The files confirmed everything. Sarah's admission in January 1985, the experimental treatments approved by her desperate parents, the catastrophic results that left her conscious but unresponsive, the decision to declare her dead and seal away the evidence. Page after page of documentation that the hospital administration claimed didn't exist, had never existed, was impossible to exist. But Thomas found something else Catherine hadn't mentioned, a second set of files in the same misfiled drawer, records for 3 other patients over the past 40 years. A security guard named Marcus Webb, who died of sudden heart failure in 2008, found in the West Wing. A nurse named Jennifer Torres, who disappeared in 2015, last seen entering the abandoned section. A maintenance worker named David Chen, who committed suicide in 2019, leaving a note about a child he couldn't save. These were the 3 people Sarah had mentioned, the ones who had been given the choice and had chosen to leave. Thomas had assumed they simply walked away and forgot. But they hadn't forgotten. They had tried to expose the truth and they had been silenced. not by supernatural forces but by very human corruption, by an institution willing to destroy lives to protect its reputation and avoid legal consequences. The hospital administration had known about Sarah all along. They had maintained the mold exposure story as cover, using it to discredit anyone who discovered the truth. And when discrediting wasn't enough, when someone persisted in seeking justice, they had taken more permanent measures. Marcus Webb's heart failure could have been induced. Jennifer Torres's disappearance could have been arranged. David Chen's suicide could have been encouraged by people who knew how to break someone psychologically. Thomas understood with horrible clarity that he was now in the same position. He had evidence the hospital couldn't allow to become public. He had knowledge that could destroy Mercy General's reputation and expose decades of cover-up. He had become a threat that the institution would need to eliminate. He photographed every document, uploaded them to secure cloud storage, sent copies to journalists and lawyers with instructions to release them if anything happened to him. Then he did something the others apparently hadn't done. He went back to room 412. The West Wing entrance was sealed again, but Thomas had kept a copy of the master key. He walked through those dark corridors one final time, no longer afraid of mold or hallucination or supernatural forces. He was afraid of what humans did to each other, of institutions that valued reputation over justice, of a world where a child's suffering could be buried and forgotten. Room 412 was empty and cold. Thomas stood in the center, holding the copied medical files, and spoke into the silence. He told Sarah that he had found the truth, that he had proof of what was done to her, that he would make sure her story was told no matter what it cost him. He apologized for almost walking away, for almost believing the lies, for being like all the others who had chosen self-preservation over doing what was right. He didn't see her this time, didn't feel any supernatural presence or experience visions. Maybe she had never been there at all. Maybe the ghost was just his guilt and the mold, exactly as the hospital claimed. Or maybe she had finally found peace, knowing that someone had chosen to stay in a different way, to remain committed to her truth rather than abandoning it for safety and comfort. Thomas left Mercy General that night and never returned. The files he released sparked an investigation that took 2 years, but ultimately confirmed everything. Sarah Brennan had existed and had died exactly as Catherine Wells described. The experimental program was exposed. Criminal charges were filed against surviving doctors and administrators. Mercy General Hospital faced lawsuits that eventually forced it to close permanently. But Thomas paid a price for his choice. He lost his job, faced harassment and threats, struggled to find work as the hospital's lawyers portrayed him as mentally unstable. His daughter reached out during this period, having seen news coverage of his whistleblowing. She told him she was proud of him for finally standing up for something, for choosing to protect a vulnerable child, even when it destroyed his own life. They reconciled slowly, carefully, building a relationship that Thomas had thought was lost forever. She told him that what had hurt most wasn't his absence, but his cowardice, the way he had always chosen the path of least resistance. Seeing him fight for Sarah, seeing him refuse to back down despite the cost, showed her a version of her father she had never known existed. It gave her hope that people could change, that it was never too late to choose courage over comfort. Thomas often wondered about the nature of what he experienced in room 412. Was Sarah's ghost real, or had his mind created her from guilt and toxic mold? He decided it didn't matter. Real or hallucination, she had given him a gift. She had forced him to confront the kind of person he had been, and choose to become someone different. She had offered him redemption, disguised as a haunting. The West Wing of Mercy General was demolished in 2027. Thomas attended, watching as heavy machinery tore down the walls that had imprisoned Sarah's body and possibly her spirit. When room 412 collapsed into rubble, he felt something shift in his chest. Not grief exactly, more like the settling of a debt finally paid. He never knew for certain what happened to Sarah's consciousness after death, whether she had truly haunted that room or whether loneliness and mold had created her from his own failures. Faith, he realized, wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing to believe in something that gave your suffering meaning, your choices consequence, your life a story worth telling. Thomas lived the rest of his years differently. He volunteered at hospitals, advocating for patient rights and ethical treatment. He rebuilt his relationship with his daughter and met his grandchildren. He carried Sarah's story with him, telling it to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive in a world that had tried desperately to forget her. And sometimes late at night, he wondered if the real horror wasn't ghosts or cover-ups or toxic mold. It was how easy it had been for everyone to walk away from a suffering child. How institutions prioritized reputation over humanity. How good people became complicit through silence and fear. The supernatural was terrifying, but human cruelty was worse because it was so common, so accepted, so easy to justify. Sarah Brennan deserved better than what she received. She deserved better than 40 years of abandonment. And maybe, just maybe, Thomas had helped give her something she never had in life. A witness who refused to look away. A voice that wouldn't be silenced. A person who chose compassion over comfort. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear. Could you have made the same choice Thomas did? Would you sacrifice everything to give voice to someone who can't speak for themselves? Tell us what you think in the comments below.